following conversation has two parts. Caroline, River, and I recorded the first segment at the same time we recorded our first episode, in the wake of the escalated genocide by Israel in Gaza. We wanted to name this atrocity that was unfolding while we were recording, since we referred to the organizing context in our original discussion. In the second segment, River and I have an extended conversation on feelings of despair and hope in view of genocide, along with the experience of the massive solidarity movement, how it affects our existing relationships, and helps us build new ones.
So this is Caroline speaking. Shuli and River and I wanted to record something separately to be in conversation with our first episode, our first conversation on the Breakup Theory podcast. And we wanted to acknowledge the context with which we recorded that episode, both being within the midst of the assault and active genocide happening in Gaza by Israel, and wanted to address that because it was heavy in all of us in our conversation, but maybe not explicitly stated. And we believe that it is important to really explicitly and unequivocally state our individual, personal, emotional, spiritual, political, and ethical feeling toward what is happening, which is that it is a genocide and that the state of Israel is enacting this genocide with the motivation of destroying Gaza. And there's a lot of conversation happening right now that really is kind of utilizing every word and like language in the book to not be explicit in that, but that the three of us do hold that is what's happening. Does anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, we wanted to set aside time to talk more specifically about some of the ideas and feelings that come up around Israel and Palestine, approaching it from this angle of breaking up and ending things, because there's a lot of confusion in the discourse around what the project of the Israeli state, the siege and assault on Gaza, the relationship between Jews and Palestinians in the land. And there's like a lot of cultural programming and motivation or weaponization of history that makes it hard to think clearly about this stuff and even talk about it. So we wanted to set aside some time just to like piece through some of those knots.
Yeah, thanks to you both for saying those things. I think a lot of the time it's said, Gaza, Palestine, Israel's too complicated. We can't talk about it. But in fact, it's not complicated at all, is it? In terms of our conversation, what I would say, there's lots of stuff to break up with, right? Shuli mentioned that indoctrination. I know that's not the word you used, but people around the world, the media hype the spiel that's being used at the moment that obfuscates what's really happening, the genocide that's really happening, the killing and destruction, and the way that we are meant to believe that certain people's lives are worth more than others, or in fact, certain people's lives are worth nothing at all, that we shouldn't care about that. Like that stuff is all very simple and very clear. And I think it's one of those things we just have to keep saying over and over again, very clearly, very explicitly. And on that note, Shuli and I are going to be recording separately an episode on, and this might be a first example of how that breakup theory can also apply to things outside of like our romantic relationships or intimate relationships, but can be to do with ideology, or it can be to do with maybe thoughts or ideas that we've held close all our lives, or stuff that we've been brought up with that feels habitual and maybe even safe, that we need to break up with, that we need to change. Behaviors and things that we need to change, ideas that we need to change, actions that we maybe fear that we need to break up with. What if we break up with fear and actually start speaking out? Our silence will not protect us, as Audre Lorde said, right? So yeah, coming soon.
Speaking as a Jewish person, there was a process for me of disconnecting from ideas of Israel, from Zionist climate that could be very explicit or sometimes just implicit. And going to what you said, River, about fear, like the way that a sort of fear of anti-Semitism created this backdrop of Zionism as a safety measure for Jews everywhere. That's something I want to delve more deeply into, is just the way that just the story of Israel is a kind of narrative around states and safety and religion that really warps our way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, something that I've been thinking about a lot and talking with people about is this internalization of like the binary of you are either good or bad. And I've been thinking about how liberal, moderate baby boomers in the US have this allegiance to Israel as a state and as a project. And that I think kind of comes from like a psychic need to align yourself with good, right? This idea of like that is good, like that keeps Jewish people safe, right? Almost as a reaction formation against the horror and guilt of the Holocaust. So even like conversations that I've had with my mother where she's been like, this is just such a generational thing, like her unequivocal, like we stand with Israel stance. And I think that we're seeing that in the kind of developmental age of the US and the developmental age of Israel as states and apartheid states and colonial, like settler colonial states are not that different. They're kind of like developmentally the same age. Like they're kind of in the developmental state of like wanting to punish. And punishment is just such a American and such a US state and an Israeli state value. So I don't know, that's just something that's been on my mind a lot. And so many of my clients, like the thing that's coming up for them is like, am I doing this right? You know, am I responding correctly? Am I reacting correctly? And it just seems like a continuation of this idea of like you're either good or bad.
Yeah, it seems also this like cancel culture type thing. People are afraid like to say the wrong thing and then to be held responsible or cancelled or whatever. Like, and that also, I suppose people feel that everything they say is like on a permanent record now. Like your employer, the visa, the immigration authorities, or anyone will have a permanent record of everything you ever said in every context and every situation. So
yeah,
that makes people maybe more afraid to speak out. But I don't know, in terms of development and an age of, like, obviously I'm based in Europe, and I think it's really interesting to see that in Germany, the younger left activists, because, you know, in Germany, this anti-Deutsch thing was a huge issue, right, on the left, that people were saying, and never again Germany, and that was used as an argument to support Israel and as an argument to support even the US as an imperialist force in the Middle East and so on, and as an argument against supporting Palestinians and so on. But that is changing. Like, for example, I saw the breaking up with the Holocaust guilt is something that is, I don't know if it's necessarily, I mean, you can still have Holocaust guilt, but break up with being anti-Deutsch, I think, or you can be, well, we talked about the non-state solution as well, right, Shuli? But I mean, I'm anti-Deutsch, but I'm anti all countries and all states and all borders, of course. But I'm talking about the very specific anti-Deutsch ideology. But I saw a few days ago that even a cafe in Berlin put out this statement saying, you know, we are not anti-Deutsch. We are fully in support of the Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere in the world. And that was really a beautiful thing to see, you know. And that you can see also, for example, the queer and trans, because it's a queer and trans-led cafe, like a big cafe called K Fetish in Köln, that you see trans and queer people organizing the Solly parties, the fundraisers, the demos, the events for Gaza in Berlin right now. That's really beautiful thing.
For us to take a quick break.
Now we're back for the second segment of our conversation with me and River.
So right now, with the invasion of Gaza and the genocide that's happening there, there's been a huge response globally of street protests and people coming together to call for an end to that death cycle, specifically like through asking governments and politicians to demand a ceasefire. So right now the thing on like everyone's mind all around the world is sort of this witnessing of a genocide in Gaza and the invasion by Israel, the mass death that they're unleashing. And in response to that, globally, there's been protest movements in the streets with people, in a different way than would have happened even 10 years ago, coming out in favor of Palestinian liberation, against sort of Zionist propaganda, and demanding to the states that supposedly represent them to call for a ceasefire, to ask Israel to stop doing this. And, like I sort of wanted to open up a conversation because the witnessing of genocide causes such feelings of despair and hopelessness. Like, we're watching, also just because social media makes it so available that we can like see all these pictures and videos and the testimony of people there, and feel totally powerless, like across the world, right? Like that we're not there to do anything, and we're trying to find ways to intervene and find ways to stop it. Personally, given my age, I'm having echoes of these, like the mass protests are so massive. There's so many people, and it reminds me of 20 years ago, the anti-war movement, right? When the US decided to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, there were so many people all around the world trying to get that to stop. And it felt so hopeless. Like we had no success, and it was massive, right? And so I'm trying to like think about what we're looking for, what we want to accomplish, what we're going to do in these moments. For me, from an anarchist perspective, that doesn't really have a lot of hope that we can get politicians to listen to us, to have conscience, to act well. So I just wanted to set up this conversation and see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, one thing that I find really interesting, and before we started recording, we talked a little bit about generations of activists, and we talked about how there's a whole new generation of activists like getting interested in Palestine, learning about it, like reading up, listening to podcasts, listening to all these interviews, and like finding each other on these marches. Like people getting clued up on what's been going on for the last 75 years or so in a way that hasn't happened for a long time. And I think that's great. But one of the other things about this new generation is that they don't actually remember, or rather they're too young to remember that time the last time we were 1 million people on the streets of London, right? That was the march against the war in Iraq in 2003. So the people that you see, the almost 1 million people we had on the street last weekend here in London, a large proportion of those people won't have a sense, oh, well, we did this before and we failed to stop the government from doing that. Now, I don't think that a lot of people who were on the street here last week would necessarily think that by us all marching, we're going to change what our current government is going to do or is doing, or we're not going to change what the Israelis are doing. Because people saying, well, these A to B marches where we're calling for a ceasefire, isn't that just calling on parliamentary democracy to do its job? Well, a lot of these people on these marches, like I think 3/4 of them are people of color, Black people and people of color here in London, at least. And these are people that have been failed by the system, by the state, systematically all their lives. So they're not expecting the state to show up for the Palestinians in the way that the state in the UK as well doesn't show up for people of color generally, at home or abroad. So I don't think people necessarily think that thousands of them or nearly 1 million of them on the streets are going to have that effect on the government, on the state, on parliament. But the reason they come out anyway is because you can't just stay at home and you have to show up. You have to say no. You have to show and be with community, with people. You have to march side by side, shoulder to shoulder with those that also do not agree with the current state of things. So it's a big showing of dissent, really. And that's the power of it. And finding each other and connecting with all these people that you end up having like random chats with or end up sharing your snacks with or whatever you brought on the march, because you do march for hours, right? So you know, the conversations you have are so unique and so powerful. And that's it, really. That's it. Finding power in community and finding power in and courage in expressing dissent is what I think is the use of these A to B marches.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot, that the experience on the streets, even if we acknowledge that the supposed effect, which is we march and get the thing we are asking for, doesn't happen, there is something that occurs in the relationships that we build, right? And I like to think sometimes that there's something in that heightened moment on the street of like a glimpse of the world that we're trying to build, that we can come together. You know, these marches are so many different kinds of people come across those differences and find each other and find that we share a passion and conscience. In terms of the generational thing, I think that's right. But then on the other hand, I don't know, particularly in the US context, like I'm like thinking about how the young people here also just witnessed the George Floyd rebellions in the US, with a massive movement that was actually really in confrontation with the state. I mean, it took to the streets in a way, like through protest, but then because of the way the state escalated violence became direct confrontation. So all these people have witnessed the cops are there to hurt you, right? They've seen it firsthand, this new generation. And that memory is fresh. And this is another thing I've talked about with people, is the quick turnaround in the amount of street actions that we've had in relation to Gaza shows that everyone is like ready right now to throw down, right? And to come out and do things. So that's also heartening, right? That we can turn around these huge, massive marches and all these people are coming out. Everyone's ready. Everyone knows like something happens and we take the streets. The thing that I wonder about is this vocabulary. Like, how much are we stuck in this vocabulary of dissent that is, let's go to the streets and march around and ask for things? I was listening to you talk about like the million people, right? And like thinking about what can we do if we have a million people beyond marching around in circles and demanding a ceasefire? One of the chants we have is like, you know, what do we want? Ceasefire. What do we want? When do we want it? Now. And then they're like, and if we don't get it, shut it down, right? Everyone says shut it down, but what does that mean? Shut it down. Shutting it down isn't marching around in circles, right? Peacefully protesting while the cops kind of guide us along and then tell us to disperse, and everyone does it, you know? So like, I wonder about this like how much we're stuck in this vocabulary of expressing dissent in a way that's contained already, even if it does create these possibilities of relationship, which I think are super important. Are we like, you know, contained in such a way that we can't see beyond this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's iterative or cumulative or whatever you want to call it, right? So a lot of people that we see out in the streets here now have never been out in the streets before. And that's great. Like, these are people who are just learning what it feels like. And I remember being that person myself when I took up a placard in that, you know, 2003 march, and was like, you know, at first I was feeling a bit shy with it. And then I was, at the end of it, I was like really waving it about like furiously. And I see people, you know, younger people doing that today. And you say like, shut it down. But what if we did actually shut it down? Like, you've told me about how in the US, and we've seen this in the UK as well, and in other places, you know, in Holland and France, or not in France actually, but in a few other places, these sit-ins at the train stations especially, right? Like, that is shutting it down. But then to some extent, either in the US, they're kind of, you know, they're kind of staged, and in the UK, we don't really shut anything down because we're sitting in a circle, and the police are like keeping a lane open for the commuters to still get to their trains and stuff. So we're not actually shutting anything down, although the police do use these special powers they have to like make the interference with major infrastructure a criminal offense. And they do then, you know, wave these flyers in your face when you're sitting down there, and like use that to threaten arrest and to get you to move and stuff. But I think these things are all iterative, right? So if you think about the career, for want of a better word, of an activist, like, you've got to go on a few marches, you've got to go on a few sit downs. And after you've kind of thought, okay, I feel, you know, I've learned something from those experiences. I felt, you know, a bit nervous, a bit awkward about like sitting down and like the cops all around me. But I did it anyway because of the force of my convictions and because I knew I was on the right side of history and all of this stuff. I did it. It was okay. What can I do now? What's next, right? What's next? And it is at that point that things will get interesting. And there's people who would, like there's other types of actions like blocking the boat or that might follow from that, Obviously, you're right. Like if we're a million people on the street, think of what that million people could actually do in terms of shutting things down. That is always the case. We have the 1% ruling the world. We are the 99%. If we wanted to, then the 1% wouldn't exist at all. But we are. I have a book here. The title is "Willing Slaves of Capital." It's Frédéric Lordon. Yeah, right. So it's all about like changing the police in our head or whatever, like getting rid of the cops in our head or the states in our head. And then like being able to do the things that go beyond like A to B marches and sit down protest.
Yeah, I mean, so like when I was talking about that like vocabulary, also I'm like thinking that one of the things that drives people is the feeling of a need to do something. One of the ways to feel like you are doing something, whether or not you are actually accomplishing the ultimate goal, is to go to a protest or whatever, right? And then I think that there's like also a heightened aspect of that is like, if you do a civil disobedience and get arrested, you're like, oh, I really did something because like I got in trouble for it. I totally understand that. And I understand the need to like be with people and to counteract the feeling of despair, the feelings of hopelessness. But I do like, personally, I'm like, I don't want to waste time and resources getting arrested and bailed out and dealing with court for a thing that feels like begging politicians to have a conscience that I know aren't going to do that. The nihilist in me is just like, we can't really do anything that like allows this society to function. I mean, there is the shut it down. There are these other like demands to shut it down. Like if the million people didn't go to work, for example, like that would stop things from happening. And that doesn't look as useful from the outside as like a million people in the streets that you can see on camera, because a million people not going to work is diffuse in this way, but the effect would be something different. And that's the thing, like, how do we get to that? Then I have another question, which I'd be curious to hear you think about. We are still being stuck in this 19th century Marxist desire for a massive politics, that like the way to get the revolution is for everyone to come together to do a thing, right? This idea, like, the proletarian has the actual power if we like took it up. And part of me feels like from this anarchist perspective that we can't hope for everyone to agree, right? And so we can't wait for everyone to be ready to act. And so I have this just like innate kind of like, or I don't know if it's innate, because I still feel pulled towards the massive politics. I just am also like skeptical that we can actually expect it to take place in the way that we hope it would, as this kind of big revolution. So I wonder what you think about still putting our energy into that, like that, which feels like potentially an outdated model.
Well, I'm an anarcho-communist, so I'm not going to get drawn into a discussion anarchist versus Marxist.
Oh, no, I don't mean that. I just mean that we still look for that. I'm not trying to bait you. I just really want to know your opinion.
I'm joking. Yeah, I think there's going to be a combination of all of the above, right? I think that the way I imagine revolution, like as a Trotskyist would say, permanent revolution, and as an anarchist would say, is this prefigurative politics and like enacting a kind of world enacting the kind of world that we want to see. And the kind of world I want to see is me marching in, not necessarily marching, but being in community with the kinds of people that I was in community with on the street last weekend. We're walking together, even walking together towards a similar goal rather than competing with each other, and like actually putting that into practice and going against the wishes of the state in doing so, because we know that in the UK, the government didn't want that march to happen, specifically because it was an armistice day, which is so ironic that we weren't supposed to be calling for a ceasefire on Armistice Day. This is kind of what the podcast is also kind of about, right? About relationships. So I want to be in a comradely relationship, and also people like Jodie Dean and Sophie Lewis write about that, right? I want to be in relation to my neighbors in a way that is comradely and that has a sense of collectivity and a shared collective goal and responsibility. To me, marching like that with 1 million people creates that temporarily, but it also creates that, like, in a way, now when I walk around the street with my keffiyeh on, like, I get random people coming up to me and like starting a chat. Or even today, there was like a woman, I was having a coffee on the market, and this woman came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm Palestinian. Can I just ask you why you're..." She put like her phone camera in my face and said, "Can I just record you saying why you're wearing that thing so I can put it on my social media?" And I was like, "Okay." It's cool because it creates, like, in a sense, a relationship that wasn't there before necessarily. And at the same time, I also think that when shit's gonna hit the metaphorical fan, whatever, things are gonna get real ugly in the street. And I do think there's going to be large amount of violence at a certain point. If things keep going in the direction they're going in, that is inevitable, whether it's a revolution that we start for the purpose of, getting to communism, or whether it's the fascist states that we inhabit these days, like, are starting to even, already in France, you see the police violence increasing at an insane rate, like using military grade explosives like on the street against, like, it's their own population who are doing like an A to B march, right? That is insane. Like, I do think it's at a certain point, like, there are going to be moments, not one moment that is going to be global, but like moments around the world that involve violence. But at the same time, like, we also do the thing of like prefigurative politics by building the networks and the connections and groups and practicing the mutual aid, or all the kinds of stuff that we've been, some of us have been doing for centuries, and some of us have only started doing perhaps during the pandemic or whenever everyone was getting into mutual aid all of a sudden. But all of those things at the same time.
Like, talking about the increased possibility of violence, I was struck at the marches I've been to at the sort of containment and the peacefulness of it. I've been like, oh, the police are leading this, right? Oh, like, we walk by a Starbucks and people are stickering the Starbucks, not breaking the Starbucks windows,
In France, they would have done.
Right. No, I mean, and that happens in the US too, but like in these marches, that hasn't been the vibe. There's been graffiti and stickering. And then I heard that the NYPD has used drones to identify people and arrest them afterwards, which is like a common tactic now. For the most part, and there's an essay that talks about this in the Haters Cafe that is contentious. People have some problems with it, but they talk about how, like, we need to articulate in the US the connection between our Palestinian solidarity movements with the anti-police movements. And so, like, in DC, at the most recent protests in DC, the police almost immediately escalated against the pro-Palestinian people with tear gassing and macing and I think batons and stuff, right? Like, people I talked to had like been hurt by the police. I don't want people to get hurt by the police, but I'm like thinking that is a sign that things are going to get ramped up, because there are reasons for the state right now to be afraid, because of the massiveness of the movements, because of the frequency with which crises bring forth people into the streets ready to throw down. I also heard in one town there was a PSL, which is like an authoritarian communist group, planned march, and it was like coming up with Veterans Day, which is funny just thinking about Armistice Day, and the city just like shut down the highways in advance, and only 30 people showed up for this march, but the city was so scared of something that like didn't even happen. Like, I think that shows something that, like, we're gonna get to this moment where I'm thinking about the U.S. context just because that's the one I'm embedded in, like, that we're going to be forced to make these movements actually confrontational in a way with state power. But this leads me to this other thought that troubles me, and I wonder what you think about it. Like, I have despair because what's happening in Gaza is happening, right? And the things what we're doing, which are aimed to try to stop it, aren't having that effect. And then I try to take hope in, like, but there's this massive movement that is pro-Palestinian, that is allowing us to identify each other, which is super important, and find our comrades and come together. But if the price of us gaining traction towards revolution or prefiguring this world is the death of so many people in Gaza, that's like an impossible, like, I can't will that, I can't be like, this is like the long view of revolution isn't worth the death of Gazans right now, you know? So the ways that I try to take hope with what's going on is also making me have to like accommodate the atrocities as like somehow part of the process in a way. I know I'm not saying that's like literally what's happening, but it's just like I can't balance the despair of genocide in Gaza with the like hopefulness that I feel with the change in response that we're seeing. And I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything you can do with that. I think that just is. One thing that I think is interesting is that we know that this isn't the first genocide in the world, and people are starting to connect the historical dots as well. Like they're talking about, was it even you or someone else said it's a genocide commemoration day today in the US, or Thanksgiving. People are understanding that this particular genocide in Gaza, which we want to stop and which we're all trying to stop, but which I know is extremely difficult to stop right now in this moment and does need the building of a movement that we are hopefully in the process of building. People are connecting that to, people are understanding that this genocide comes out of a settler colonialist project. I think that is the first time that like the masses on the street understand that about the Palestinian situation. And they're connecting that to the settler colonial projects in other parts of the world, in other times in history, including starting to connect that with the settler colonial projects in the US and Ireland. So many Irish flags on the demonstrations in the last few weeks as well. You know, it's an idealist argument. Like, I don't think we'll change the world by changing everyone's minds, but once everyone understands why this kind of violence happens, then it's also going to be easier. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know where I'm going with these thoughts, but
no, it actually that brought something up for me because it's interesting because like, yeah, I think people are making this connection. Like when I've been on the marches, I've been really heartened to see the connections drawn between the settler colonial state of Israel with the settler colonial state of the US that we inhabit. But it's interesting. Like I was listening to Richard Seymour on The Dig talking about Gaza, and he's like has pretty good analysis. He was talking about the nation state. This is something I've been thinking about. I'm writing about. And I'm gonna like share an essay soon with people. And then he's like, Israel is a settler state, and like basically he's like it's the only one in the world right now. And I was like, how can this guy be saying this? I was like, I don't know if he's Irish, but he sounds almost like he's maybe Irish. And then there's like the US and Canada, right? And Australia and New Zealand, all these settlers, and the persistence of South Africa after apartheid too, right? Like, and like when I have conversations with people about the violence of Hamas or whatever, I'm like, think about we're 500 years in the US into an ongoing genocide by the settler state, and it's 75 years around of a genocide in Israel. And the violence and the out and out violence of resistance by the indigenous people in the US only stopped like 130 years ago, right? Like there was hundreds of years of armed military conflict between indigenous people and the settlers in the US. So like if you just like put those things at scale, it's like it's very telling how much the settler state goes to like kind of normalize and erase and kind of adapt us to this. And so I think that's true. And it's something that I, you know, as an educator and writer, really engage myself in, is like trying to make people see the way the world is actually structured, because I feel like when people like kind of see that structure, something shifts and that they want to refuse to participate in it. But going back to this thing about like a million people could shut it down if we decided to do this thing, like I'm like, I gotta work, you know, I gotta like make money to survive. I still get sucked into my involvement with bare survival that capitalism allows me, to the detriment of liberation. I'm like constantly plugged back into it, right? And felt like I need to produce things to make my living. And I've just been wrestling with that contradiction too, of like having to like work while this is happening, you know? I think about that a lot, because part of what I think about in Gaza too is like Israel represents the imposition of European standards of living, right? Like Israel is a settler state that has a tie to the European Western nation state. It's about imposing a Western standard of living, a Western idea of civilization. And that's how we can also excuse the genocide of Palestinians, because we picture them as somehow outside of that and like primitive to that, right? Like how much we in the West, the comforts that we have in our post-industrial consumer life come at that cost. Thinking about like that video of the Israelis doing yoga, you know, like we have such a comfortable life that that keeps us, you know, at bay, so that we can, again, this is my nihilist voice speaking, like we could do this like street movements and go to work normally, you know.
Yeah. I've just remembered what you were asking about before. You mentioned what if we all walked out? What if we all stopped work? The Palestinian workers or Workers for Palestine, I don't know if it's the Palestinian unions and a coalition of like Western people or people in the UK or maybe even beyond, who are trying to like amplify the demands or the suggestions made by Palestinian unions. I think it's called Workers for Palestine. They're on Instagram as well. They have called for walkouts, right? So there have been walkouts like last week. On Thursday, there were walkouts like the week before. They were quite small scale. You know, I was telling you about how this member of parliament in the UK, we had a vote in parliament suggested by it was like a motion brought by the Scottish Nationalist Party, who've been quite sound on Palestine, partly because one of their leader, his wife is Palestinian, and his grandmother, or her mother rather, has been in Gaza, and is like this Scottish granny who's been like doing his videos from Gaza. It's touched a lot of people's hearts. So the Scottish National Party has called for a vote on a ceasefire in the UK Parliament. Last week, the Labour Party, under the leadership of Keir Starmer, who's like to the very right of the Labour Party, hasn't been. And there was I don't know if you know this concept, 3-line whip, like where the leadership of the party says all the MPs have to vote this way in this. It is an open vote, but if you vote against the party line, you can basically be sacked from the shadow cabinet, so from your shadow ministerial position, which is an important position because you're in line to become the minister if the party wins at the next election. So these people voted, and then like 50 or so of the Labour members of parliament actually voted against the party line and got their repercussions. But the people who didn't, they all abstained, like 150 or something abstained. Nobody voted against the ceasefire, but abstaining is pretty much because the motion didn't pass, right? Because of that. And so these people committed like career suicide. I think in certain boroughs, in certain electoral districts like Tower Hamlets, where in East London, which is a home to mostly like people of Bangladeshi background, so mostly Muslim community. And there was a spontaneous mass walkout of the schools there, of kids, teenagers. It's amazing to see, actually, teenagers. Yeah. They can't even vote yet, but they're smart enough to realize this is what's happening. They were all on the march on Saturday, and now they have this MP who's somebody from their own community, Roshanara Ali, who voted in a careerist way for herself to stay within the shadow cabinet rather than voting with her conscience or voting with the will of the people that she's supposed to represent. And I think that is one of those moments again that people realize that they're not being represented by the political system, not even when they're members of their own community, because power corrupts. And once you're in that system, so these kids that walked out of school are like turned into anarchists like on that day, basically. Next week, the walkout is called for Friday. I think it's international, so you might see stuff about it. In the UK, we have hugely repressive anti-union laws that Margaret Thatcher brought in. So you can actually get sacked if you walk out of your workplace, if you break your contract, because you can only strike if it's within like the parameters of a very distinct dispute with your employer, like about your wages or conditions or whatever. You can't just strike for the general political situation, which you can do in France, for example, which is pretty amazing, where they haven't yet, although they're going that way, like they are introducing those anti-strike laws as well. Yeah, so a lot of the chance here, like we were talking about Black Lives Matter and the abolitionist movement, and how it's amazing that we all became abolitionists in that period, right? The Black Lives Matter uprising helped us to understand, helped so many of us to understand why we needed to be abolitionists. Now, on the marches, you hear the chants, Rishi Sunak, you can't hide, we charge you with genocide. Netanyahu, you can't hide, we charge you with genocide. Which is
we say Biden here too.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's a carceral response, right? It's not an why has that abolitionism not stuck, you might think? But I think actually those chants are like imminent critiques. So those chants are like sort of doing that theater of criminal trials, like show trials. You're vocalizing the fact that you know that Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak or Netanyahu are never going to be in court, by actually asking for it and showing that you know that the system doesn't work in the way that it kind of makes out it would work if you know what I mean, right?
Totally. I mean, this is something I've also felt like a mix of hope and despair. I'm like, is the best that we can hope from in these moments, that more and more people become awakened to the fact that the system that's supposedly there to help us and like make our lives better doesn't serve us. Like, this has been the lesson of the Stop Cop City, Defend the Atlanta Forest movement, where it's been a pretty popular, massive movement of different people, different backgrounds, with a diversity of tactics, and including a bunch of tactics that have gone through the quote unquote proper channels of asking the government or telling the government what people want. And the city has just really blatantly done dirty tricks to not take on what people want and to keep going ahead with the movement, and then just ratchet up intense charges against protesters. But the cop city is like getting built, right? And so what do we learn, like in George Floyd too, right? The police aren't here to help us. The state's not here to help us. The state doesn't listen. The politicians don't listen. They don't care. When I'm like, is this the best that we can hope for? That feels limited to me, although still heartening in a way, because I think it's an important realization for everyone to have. And I don't know how to create those possibilities myself, right? Like just by teaching people about it. But on the other hand, it is also pointing to, and I think this is what you're talking about, that there is like a real crisis in management by the state, by all the states, right? The uptick of fascism, of like blatant fascism across the world, is showing the desperation of this nation state formation and the ongoing crises of capitalism to maintain order. And I think it's like grasping at straws, especially in the face of like climate catastrophe, where the world as we know it is changing all the time, and people are just like less willing to play along. So I think that the way that I see this showing up in the particular moment with Gaza, for example, is like in schools, where schools are literally shutting down the possibility of learning about Palestine and Israel in like a real way. They're like really stopping that possibility. They're criminalizing student activity. Like, you can see very blatantly the heavy hand of the state in its attempt to rule. And that does speak to this crisis. And so I think it's a little bit more than just like, oh, like the best we can hope for is that people will like see that this stuff doesn't work. Like, I think we're actually like the children that you're talking about, the youth who are leading these movements, are actually like so much earlier than maybe our generation being confronted with this fact. Like I grew up in like the 80s and 90s, where there was the illusion of comfort for more people, and that doesn't exist anymore. That is like a change. And like Israel has been forced to show its hand as a bloodthirsty giant, right? That's like willing to kill people in face of a worldwide massive movement to like stop it, right? Like, there's not a real way, I think, for Israel to come back from this and maintain its like previous reputation or whatever in the world stage.
At the same time, we mustn't forget that 1 million people were killed in Iraq. Right? 1 million people were killed in Iraq. And we're just, oh, well, 1 million people, whatever. Like, that doesn't even register. Like, it's not even, but there's a huge difference now in that the way that we, at the time, obviously, we didn't see that happen. And now we're seeing it happening on our phones and on our TV screens and everything. And I think you're saying, yeah, schools are banning, like in the UK, not so much yet, although I see it on a like one-to-one basis, like some events people are being told you can't run this event or you get into trouble at work, whatever. In France, they've banned all pro-Palestinian events at universities, I think. Although people are still doing it, and maybe they're banning like the teaching. I just listened to the final short episode with the comrade from who was the anti-Zionist who lived in 48, and is an activist there. He was saying that people can even watching a video, or even like having something on your phone that shows that you've watched something, that you've basically tuned into Al Jazeera or something, that could get you arrested. But people are like, I don't know, there it's obviously extreme, but in the UK and US, students, young people will still go home and watch everything on their social media. And you've seen that there's these Instagram people like Bizan, for example, in Gaza, Bizan, wizard. And she puts out little videos every day, and some days she can't. But everyone is like, "Oh, but I need to know if Bizan is still alive, because this is like she's become a real part of people's lives."
Yeah.
But we know that she will get targeted. The Israelis killed 50 journalists within Gaza already in the last few weeks. 50 journalists wearing these blue press jackets and helmets and stuff, like targeted. They killed that Al Jazeera guy's his entire family. Like they targeted my friend's home, who is one of the human rights lawyers that works for one of the main human rights organizations in Gaza. Yeah, illusion of comfort, right? I think when I was growing up, definitely. There was still a sense that if you did your best and kept your nose clean, you could have a good and comfortable life, And I think that today's young people don't have that sense anymore, don't have that illusion anymore.
Can I bring us to something about media? I think the different, like you brought up the number of Iraqis who were killed, right? And we started out this conversation kind of comparing to the anti-war movement of 20 years ago. The fact of 9/11 helped manufacture the consent, or allow the possibility for us, even with a massive movement, anti-war movement, for that to go on in a way that it's not happening right now, right? Like we're seeing more blatantly, everyone is seeing more blatantly that the media and the politicians are trying to portray things and silencing people, and so that there's less possibility for them to hide it from us, right? And so more and more people are coming out against this war in a way that feels different than 20 years ago in some ways, even though I have my nihilist despair. But that brings up the thing about social media, right? And this is something you were talking about. This is a conversation that I have people asking me this question a lot. What the role of social media is in this moment. Because there's this goes back to the kind of relationship thing too. People are saying to other people, you need to be posting about only Gaza, right? And you can't post about anything else. And I've seen a lot of people shaming other people for doing anything else with their social media. And then people have been asking me what do I think about this? Is this a useful tactic? And I feel really mixed about this, because on the one hand, I do think that the possibility of this massive movement against Israel's genocide in Gaza has come through all of this education that has happened over the last decades, right? But I've really seen a shift in the last 10 years in this. And so I think the ongoing kind of social media education that people are doing is an important part of this. And yet I just I still am the revolution isn't in posting, right? That's not where it happened. Shaming people into doing it, or yelling at people for not doing it. And that gets me to this other question again, I don't know, it's recruitment, or who are we aiming our conversations at? To what extent are we in an echo chamber? I find myself personally not willing to engage in conversations with a certain type of Zionist who I don't think is going to have a good faith discussion with me. And I've also seen people close to me who are liberal, lefty, progressive Jews slip into Zionism and show these really insidious kind of arguments that try to defend Israel. and that for me, I also don't want to engage with, even though that's an opportunity for me as like an educator and writer and whatever to like come in, and I like don't have the wherewithal to do that for some reason. Like I feel too upset by what I'm seeing. So I just like wonder what you think about like if part of our struggle from the outside of Gaza is to continue to spread the word, and like like where is that effective? How do we do it? Is like shaming a good tactic? Is social media like imperative right now? How is that not just like being part of the spectacle and the corporate sort of illusion of doing things too?
Yeah, collectivism. Yeah, absolutely. I think we know how powerful social media can be in the fact that obviously Elon Musk paid zillions to try and control it, and now he is, and he realized he can't really control it, but he's trying anyway, etc. And the algorithms all exist to like push a certain type of content and not other types. And there was a really interesting moment maybe 2 weeks ago or so when Gazans started posting pictures of themselves with cats, videos with cats. Every Gazan suddenly had a cat. And I think they're trying to beat, because the algorithm also works on the basis of like recognition of what's in the picture. And if they see a cat, then they'll push the image, right? Like, so I don't know if it works like that, but that's the impression I get anyway. So suddenly every Gazan had a cat, and there were loads of cats in all the Gaza content, and they were trying to fuck with the algorithm. And I thought that was really funny, because the algorithm isn't human, and the human can outsmart the algorithm in certain circumstances. And that's cool. That's cool. In terms of the shaming, I was going to say something earlier also about ego, right? So in the neoliberal age, whatever, we're all encouraged to find our identity and live our authentic lives and be our true selves and all this kind of stuff. We're supposed to really focus on the individual and who and what we are. So when we've internalized this, and as anarchists or activists, we've internalized this as well, and we need to fight this, right? So a lot of the time, so I was in an activist meeting the other day, which was like a first call out for let's set up a new group to do, or to do a new thing. And we did a big go around, and everyone had to say their name and what brought them to the meeting. And people were saying things like, yeah, so my purpose of coming to the meeting was I want to find my place in this movement. I want to know what my role could be, or what my contribution could be. And like a lot of it is about people, like you said, feeling that despair and feeling powerless and thinking, okay, what can I do? What can I do? But at the same time, there is a real pressure that we put upon ourselves to be like, what is the most effective thing that I could possibly do? Will the world collapse if I don't go on this demo? Like, will Israel continue to kill thousands of people if I don't go on this demo? You feel guilty for not going, or you feel bad or you feel like you have to find, people get so stressed, you have to find the thing to do, and everything has to be about that. But at the same time, nothing that you or I as an individual will do will be the thing that stops the genocide, will be the thing that historians in 100 years' time will say, okay, that moment when that person did that thing, that was when everything changed, right? And we kind of have this desire to like find that thing, but at the same time, it doesn't matter what you do. Like, we all need to be doing something. We all need to be doing something that makes a reasonable amount of sense, and somebody needs to be making the sandwiches. Somebody always needs to be making, and if it's you that makes the sandwiches, that's great, because somebody needs to be making the sandwiches, right? Like, we have to stop like thinking, what is that thing that is my unique contribution? Just make the fucking sandwiches already. Like, do something, get the cardboard, get the paint, book the coach to go to the bus to go to the protests, or whatever. Everyone the most mundane things, like we always talk about this division of labor within anarchist communities between like the being on the barricades and then the kind of background work. Well, I saw how much work goes into, like, there was a blockade of the arms factory here in Kent, outside of London, like last week or the week before. Being in some of the signal groups that organized that, the insane amount of work that goes into having 400 people stand in a muddy field on a Friday morning. And I didn't stand in the muddy field on a Friday morning, and I felt really bad about that because I wasn't there when the pictures were being taken and when the shouting happened, etc. But I'd been there, like, in the lead up to, and that work is also important. And we've got to just also give ourselves credit for, like, for making the sandwiches or whatever, booking the coach or any of that stuff. And at the same time, this chimes in with that shaming and that fuck those people who shame. Like, no, you still have your life. You still have your cat. You still have your lunch. Maybe you had a very delicious salad. Can you take a picture of that delicious salad and put it on Instagram? Yes, of course you can. Even Bisan said it, Bisan from Gaza. She said one of her videos, one of the really powerful ones, she said, you know what, I'm still alive, but I don't know if that's a good thing, you know. Sometimes people ask, are you afraid to die? But actually, I'm afraid to live because, like, what is this life around with bombs falling all around me, you know? And I'm telling you people in Europe or in the US or whatever, enjoy your lives while you can. Because, like, I can't, and enjoy it for me. Like, post your cat pictures, post pictures of your baby or your lunch or whatever. Like, the people who shame you, you know, they're more concerned about their own. Maybe they even feel like, you know, this Puritanism, right? Like, if I don't shame you for this, then I've failed to call you out on a thing that you're supposed to do, and that makes me then unpure or whatever. Like the impurity that you manifested by, like, posting a cat picture or something. So
Yeah,
that's
actually,
all bullshit to me.
yeah, no, actually, like, that's helping me put some things together because, you know, you started out talking about, like, everyone gets stuck in this thought of, like, I'm the one, or, like, what action do I contribute that's going to be, like, helpful to the thing that tips the balance, that, like, stops the whatever, right? Like, we get so involved in our kind of individual narratives and, like, these hero narratives of like that this is like a heroic quest that we're doing, that we're embarking on. And I think that that's what fuels a lot of that shaming thing too. It's like wanting to do something and feel like you're doing something and feeling righteous in what you're trying to do, and then you, like, come out and say, well, anyone who's not doing this is doing something bad. And I don't know, I think it's stuck in that whole way of thinking of, like, my voice is the most important voice, or is an important voice. I have to feel like it's important and it's worth it, that what I'm doing. But then I want to tie this together to, like, this other thing of, like, okay, on the other hand, like, you know, what Bisan's saying, I think about a lot from an anarchist perspective. And then this is sort of what, like, for me is behind the idea of this, like, podcast, is, like, we aren't fighting to fight, right? Like, if all we're doing is fighting this power, we're ceding a lot of power to this structure. And so we have to find reasons that we're living, right? And it can't just be bare survival, because that's not good enough. And it can be confusing to navigate this because a lot of the things that give us pleasure are, like, totally commodified and, like, caught up in this whole system of shit that we're involved in that keeps us like little, like, you know, rats in cages or whatever. And yet, like, there's other moments of beauty and joy that we have that we can share, and maybe they are mediated in ways, but, like, that's what we're fighting for, that's what we're living for. And that is, like, often I think there's the moment in the streets where you find connection, and there's, like, the sharing, the breaking bread with each other, the sandwich making or whatever, right? But we do have to have, like, beauty in our life. It can't just be righteous anger, indignation, and struggle. That's not the world that we want. And so this actually makes me think about this other thing that I'm considering, just, like, tactic wise. Like, okay, so I was starting out this conversation with, like, my sort of nihilist critique of, like, what I feel is, like, liberal spectacle politics of protest, that we're, like, asking politicians to do things that we know they're not going to do. I don't personally believe that there's a political solution to anything. Like, I don't want political solutions, because political solutions are tied up in the system that I want to destroy. And I don't believe that there is one that is good enough, because it still will reassert these state systems. But could we think about this in this kind of shame, life disruption way of, rather than begging politicians to do our bidding, which they won't, make their individual lives miserable because they shouldn't have peaceful lives. They shouldn't be able to live their lives. Not about like asking them to vote differently, but just to be like, you don't deserve any kind of peace. And I think about this because this is something I've been turning over in my head, because I watched this video of like a Palestinian woman disrupting Elizabeth Warren at a restaurant. Elizabeth Warren is a senator in the U.S. and she like was like, Senator Warren, I want to talk to you about my family who's like been killed in Gaza. And Elizabeth Warren's response was, I'm eating dinner, right? A total dismissal of this person's existence. And I was like thinking that we're a totally different species to politicians. The same way that like on the street, like a quote unquote normal person can totally dismiss the existence of an unhoused person who's like in distress, right? Like ignore it. The politicians think about us that way. Like we are not really worth their time of day in any manner. This is where I'm trying to put these things, pull some of these things together. It's like, rather than think about engaging with politicians through political action, just engaging with them of like making their lives fucking miserable, because that's what they do to so many other people. I was actually one of the first actions in New York in response to Israel bombardment of Gaza after October 7th was to storm Chuck Schumer's house during Shabbat dinner. That is, to me, something beyond just the spectacle of lockdown and civil disobedience. It's like, this guy cannot have peace, I don't know. What do you think about those ideas?
I think that sounds really powerful, that storming of Chuck Schumer's house. Personally, I think Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson, any of these, are they actually happy? Are they actually like enjoying their lives? Like, I don't think they're happy. How can you be happy if you're an asshole like that? Like if your happiness exists because you are so insanely violent towards other people, economically, administratively, in all the different ways. If you enact that violence every day, how can you really be happy? I don't know. Like maybe I don't really understand that. And to be honest, I don't really care. While I see the temptation, I don't really give a fuck about these guys. Like, I don't think they're happy. I don't care about them. To me, I care about them as little as, although they obviously have a greater impact on my life than, and this is what, perhaps what you're getting towards.
Well, like this is another way of putting it, like instead of like the political solutions, right? There's a lot of power that's exercised by keeping the social peace, right? This idea that Elizabeth Warren's like, you do not deserve my dinner, right? And like, I can think about that as like a child sitting at the dinner table and you're like, disrupting dinner in some way, and that dinner is supposed to be this thing that's like civilized and a specific kind of social peace is kept by having dinner in a specific way. And I think that is one of the more insidious ways that power works, that's not specifically like the police baton, right? And so connecting, even just these marches are potential disruptions to the social peace. Like that's the thing I think we need to like keep doing, because whether or not they enjoy their lives, I don't know, but they do expect a sort of social order to persist, and they are threatened when that's disrupted in various ways. And then that disruption of social order for us in the actual moment of doing that, whether that's in the streets like holding signs and marching in circles or whatever we're doing, is forming the potential other social order that doesn't keep the peace.
Absolutely. And I think we should continue on all of these fronts, whether it's disrupting events or gala dinners or whatever, that's or speeches or award ceremonies. Or I know that there was a huge amount of effort put into activists not disrupting the armistice events we had last weekend. That I'm sure that would have happened if they hadn't they literally brought all the police from the entire country to London to protect the cenotaph, this monument for them. I was just listening to 12 Rules for What did a great episode on that just now, and on the far right, like being allowed to like be near it and the left not. So disrupting the existing order of things in every way, especially if it's in a way that you enjoy, whether you enjoy like burning shit down. Because in France, like I could see the 1st of May, right, when all the banks on the route of the march, all the banks, all the estate agents, all the insurance companies, all the temp agency, the employment agencies had their windows smashed. The sound systems that were carried along, the supermarket, especially the organic supermarket, that had its windows smashed at lunchtime, and then everything was distributed. The joy in like some creative destruction, in some like smashing, right, or some burning, because several cars were burned, and everyone was taking their selfies with the burning cars and stuff. There was a lot of joy, and Eros, right, Eros and revolution. There's a lot of joy and a lot of passion and stuff in that. There's joy in a subversive, like subvertising. There's joy in doing like a few years ago, London Palestine Action did a great video when Israel was hosting the Eurovision Song Contest, and they did like a spoof of Madonna's like a Virgin. Let's post a link in the show notes. That video. But yeah, it's, if you can, didn't Adrian Marie Varna write a book about that? How we find joy in joyful militancy.
Oh no, that's Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery.
Right.
But yeah, no, that, I mean, it's also like this old situationist idea too, right? Of the détournement, like hijacking the things that are supposed to be like commodities and moving them towards something else, which the Eurovision thing is, and then like the altering the psychogeography of the city through like the dérive or whatever. Like, I think that's also what street movements do. Like, we're on the streets in a different way. We're not on the streets it may be orderly in the fact that we're like being led in a circle or whatever, but it's using them against the purposes of like business as usual. Although there is a way that protest becomes business as usual. But it does give us the possibility of this landscape being used differently, which also, like, you know, smashing windows or even just graffitiing and putting up Palestinian flags everywhere or like stickers, like, it shows us that like we can relate to the land and the structures like slightly differently too. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is why I'm so interested in focusing on our relationships as a location for changing the world, because there has to be a reason why we're doing all this stuff, which comes to me in like the daily life that we live with each other. And I do think like maybe the strongest thing that happens for us in all of these movements, even if we're like powerless to stop the death machine immediately through our actions, is that we form and reform relationships along different lines that lead to different possibilities, that in the event of these crises we like come together and do stuff. It's just hard to live with the death that we watch while this is happening too, you know? Like, it's impossible.
It's impossible.
Should we end there?
Yeah. I was trying to think of a catchy little sentence to like end with, but yeah. Let's burn shit down. Let's just continue all of the stuff that brings us joy. Let's disrupt.
Yeah.
That's my catchy sentence, but that's what I was thinking.
I kind of just like that, like, ending with like that impossible, just because I don't want to resolve this like it's okay, because like it's not.
Thank you for listening to The Breakup Theory. Your hosts are Shuli and River. You can reach us at patreon.com/thebreakuptheory.